Glad to be here today with all of you, and just wanted to begin by acknowledging that I am calling in from the ancestral lands of the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa tribes, all members of the Council of the Three Fires. I pray that in the merit of our work together, our spiritual work together today and every day, that we will somehow help to tilt the scale toward greater justice in our country for those who have been oppressed and relegated to the margins, and especially the Native American community. If you're here today for the first time, no problem. I want to give you just a quick précis of what we did yesterday, and then we're going to build on that today and go a little bit deeper. Each of the lessons is really a standalone, but together they'll add up to something that is greater than the sum of its parts. I also just want to say that the title for this series comes directly from the Psalms and is inspired by that chant by Aviva Chernik, a friend of IJS, a teacher here at IJS on a fairly regular basis. And the words mean Hameitzar Karatiya Anani Vamerchavya, right? I called out to the one from the narrow place. That word Meitzar is related to the name Mitzrayim, Egypt, the narrows, the narrow place. So I called out to the one from the narrows, and I was answered with expanse. And during yesterday's session, we explored some classical Hasidic teachings that really invited us to consider that the personal constriction and narrowness that we often feel in our lives is actually an outgrowth of our lack of knowing who we truly are. And as such, the gateway to freedom, the gateway to expansiveness, the gateway to finding greater spaciousness in our lives is to actually know ourselves deeply and truly, to know who we truly are. Today we're going to be exploring the question of how it comes to be that we fall into a case of mistaken identity, clinging to a small sense of self that tends to be pretty narrow and tight and defensive and reactive. As we kind of deeply dive into that question for a short period of time today, as deeply as we can go during that time, we'll also have an opportunity to study some text that will frame our practice for today. So really, if we step back and think about the trajectory of our learning this week, it's going to really ultimately be about being able to distinguish between the narrow and contracted everyday self that we tend to inhabit as human beings and our true nature, which we might call our divine self, capital S, right? I also just want to reiterate what I said yesterday, which is that for the first 3 days of this series, we're really focusing on our own personal liberation from constriction. And then on Thursday, we'll begin to explore the ways in which our personal practice and our work of better recognizing our true nature and breaking free of the clutches of the ego, how that work can ultimately support collective liberation in our world. So without further ado, I want to jump into today's content. I'll actually ask Rachel here, who's making things run smoothly behind the scenes, to put up our screen share for today. And if you want to take a look at the source sheet later on, you're welcome to click on the link that Rachel included in the chat, which will take you to a PDF of the source sheet that you can download for yourself and keep on file. Rachel, if you wouldn't mind making it just a tiny bit bigger, if that's possible, that would be helpful. The text is pretty small. Again, our key question, our guiding question today is, how does it come to be that we don't know who we truly are? How does it come to be that we don't know who we truly are? How does it come to be that we identify with a small and a narrow sense of self? Okay. I actually want to begin here with Tara Brach, who's a contemporary mindfulness teacher, psychotherapist, and who trained in a number of Buddhist schools, including Southeast Asian schools, including Tibetan schools of Buddhism. And so she has this beautiful meld of Buddhist principles and contemporary psychotherapy. And here she quotes the Sufi poet Rumi, who is quoted as saying, "What comes into being gets lost in being and drunkenly forgets its way home." What comes into being gets lost in being and drunkenly forgets its way home. Okay. So yesterday we explored the ways in which we tend to get lost in a flurry of habitual thought patterns. And we explored the ways in which those thought patterns are not truly who we are. They're actually impermanent mental events that are moving through our consciousness. And perhaps when Rumi talks about this and suggests that we get lost, right, that's one aspect that he may be talking about, that we tend to become lost and completely subsumed into, blended into, wrapped up in the activity of the thinking mind. And as a result, we forget our way home. But Tara Brach lifts up another aspect of this, which is that as part of the human journey, we each forget the vastness and depths of our awareness and love, and we become increasingly identified with a limited body and mind. Limited body and mind. Donning masks to hide the pain of unmet needs and to defend our vulnerability, we further narrow our sense of who we are. We wear the disguise of busy, important person, or angry victim, deficient person, or obsessed, addicted person. Sometimes it's depressed person, or anxious person, superior person, loser. Most of us have a whole closet full of assumed personas. They might help us survive some challenging times, but the problem is we become identified with our masks, and we end up believing that these false images are who we really are. Okay. Rachel, if there's some way to augment the text, that would be great. But essentially, what Tara Brach is saying is that, life is hard. And it's hard to cope in these lives that we have, especially when we're children, especially when we're little children. And in some ways, we're defenseless and we don't have a very expanded quality of consciousness. And nor do we have a lot of tools at our disposal to manage some of the pain and our unmet needs as children. So we develop these identifications with certain personas, right? And actually, we may know this or we may not know this, but in Greek society, right, a persona, the word persona in Greek actually means a mask, right? And so actors would don personas when enacting a play, but no one made the mistake of thinking that the actor is the mask, right? No one made that mistake. Everyone knew that the play would be over and people would take off their masks and you would see who they really are underneath the mask. Our problem, and I've seen this in my own experience play out many, many hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, is that we don these personas in order to cope with the difficulties of life, but then we actually forget that they're personas. We think they are who we really are, right? So think, for example, of a time in your life when you told yourself a story, right? When there was a thought in your mind about, the kind of person you always are in this or that situation, right? Okay, that happens to all of us, We become identified with these personas and we forget that we're even wearing masks. And then that would be really hard, if that were the case, if that was the only truth. But Brach says, just as it's a natural part of the human journey to put on these masks and get lost behind them, it's also part of our evolutionary unfolding to wake up to the fact that we are caught in a mistaken and confused identity. Sooner or later, slowly or quickly, we come to see that we've been living in a trance attached to a cluster of familiar masks that keep us believing we are separate and deficient. Courageously attending to the suffering of this trance awakens our longing to reconnect with the basic goodness we have always intuited is here. That suffering and longing are our own awareness, calling us home to our full intelligence, sensitivity, and love. So what she's suggesting here is we don't have to be lost in our identification with these personas. We can actually attend to them and notice the ways in which clinging to these different personas keeps us small, keeps the heart contracted and defensive, right? Essentially creates a lot of constriction for us. And when we do that, we can then begin to soften our attachment to these small senses of self that we have developed and remember who we truly are. Remember who we truly are. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, was getting at this when he talked about the difference between Moses and Pharaoh. The difference between Moses and Pharaoh, and he's commenting here on the verse from Exodus chapter 3 that describes how God appeared to Moses in a burning bush. And most people, when they see a conflagration in the dry desert, would run the other way, thinking that, oh my God, this is going to spread pretty quickly. But Moses turns. He actually turns toward the site to take a closer look. And it's in the next verse, which we're reading now, verse 4, that Yud-He Vav-He, our epithet for God, saw that Moses had turned aside to look. And at that point, Yud-He Vav-He called out to him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and Moshe answered, here I am, Hineni, right? That classic Jewish mindfulness trope. Hineni, I am here, I am present, I'm ready to serve. And says the Baal Shem Tov that during the Egyptian exile, awareness vanished. Awareness vanished. Think of slaves, right? They don't have time to sit down and meditate. They don't have time to contemplate their deep nature, their true nature, right? They're just trying to survive. In terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, right? They're at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Just making sure that they can make it through the day, that they'll have enough to eat, that they'll get a little bit of rest before they have to wake up in the morning and do the whole thing over again, right? They're really acting from impulse. They're really acting from viscera, Their survival instinct is really what drives them moment by moment, day by day, year by year, okay? So awareness vanished. There wasn't a whole lot of mindfulness or awareness in Egypt. And that's why scripture writes, when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to look, right, which the Baal Shem Tov understands to be some kind of a rekindling, a reawakening of awareness, right? Moshe is looking, he's observing, right? The rest of the Jewish people are caught in this kind of impulsive way of being, this very visceral way of being. They don't have time to cultivate mindfulness. Moshe is distant. Moshe is far away. He's in the wilderness. He's in solitude, right? He's in some ways far enough from the suffering that he can actually turn and take a deeper look. He can turn and take a deeper look. And this is why the nation of Israel, says the Baal Shem Tov, was in exile under Pharaoh, right? Because Pharaoh represents, he's an archetype, the dimension of ha'oref. If you rearrange the letters in the word paro, you get the word ha'oref. Rachel, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down, that would be super helpful. Oref means the neck or the back of the neck, right? As in the phrase am kshe oref, when we talk about the Jewish people as being a people of stiff neck, of a stiff neck, right? Stiff-necked people. Sorry, I need to be able to see the rest of the Baal Shem Tov text. If you're able to do that, Rachel. Yeah, kind of the bottom of that page and the top of the next page. That's better, thanks. So Pharaoh represents turning away from suffering, turning away from experience, right? Turning away from perhaps his own essential nature. And that kind of turning away, says the Baal Shem Tov, is a kind of forgetfulness. It's a kind of forgetfulness. It's not the forgetfulness of, I forgot my keys when I left the house, right? It's a forgetfulness that in some ways is a willful forgetfulness, right? An inability to, or a lack of will to actually pay close attention, This is why, let's scroll down to the next page. This is why Pharaoh said, I do not know Yod He Vav He, which is what Pharaoh said when Moshe approached him and said, God said, let us go celebrate in the desert for 3 days so we can have a festival for Yod He Vav He. Pharaoh says, Lo yadati et Yod He Vav He. I don't know Yod He Vav He, which our teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, understands to be the opposite of awareness. In other words, knowing Yod He Vav He is being aware, knowing God in our tradition, right? Which is not a being, capital B, but being itself, which is what's connoted by the word Yod He Vav He. God is not a being, but being itself, existence itself, right? Requires awareness, right? Requires awareness. And until the dimension of Moses, the dimension of awareness was revealed in the world, right? It was possible for a tyrant like Pharaoh to say,
Looks like Sam is just having a technical difficulty. Bear with us for 1 minute because we're really waiting with bated breath to hear what Pharaoh would say. So hold on 1 sec.
hi friends, I don't know why, but I got bumped off the call for a second. But that's okay. So the way the Baal Shem Tov is teaching here, right, we have these two archetypes that are opposites of one another. There's awareness and there's forgetfulness, right? The opposite of awareness is not mindlessness, it's forgetfulness. All of this transpired through Moses, who, while tending the flock, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Chorev, the mountain of God. In other words, Moses, right, needed to, in some ways, be, as I said before, far away from all of the suffering and all of the constriction and all of the pain, and go into solitude, a kind of personal mini retreat. And then he was able to cultivate this quality of awareness that allowed him to overcome the forgetfulness that had kind of beset the Israelites and the Egyptian people. So I'm not going to actually take us through the next text, so you can take down the screen share, Rachel. But what I do want to do is just share the metaphor that's there. Before we do that, I just want to say what the Baal Shem Tov is saying here is something very helpful in my experience, because he's saying it's actually not our fault. It's not our fault that we forget who we are and get entrapped by the ego, right? It's just a function of our conditioning. We are conditioned to forget. This is our default state. Our default state is that we actually turn away from our true nature and get entrapped in a small sense of self and all of these temporary personas that we've adopted to help us cope. It's not our fault, right? And the metaphor that's offered in the next text, which is from Rabbi Meshulam Feibish of Zboraj, which was a Ukrainian village that still exists. And this individual was actually a student of Rabbi Yechiel Michal of Zlachov, who himself was a direct student of the Maggid of Mezrich, who was the leader of the Hasidic movement in the second generation. He gives this metaphor. He says, imagine you were in a wagon and you're going along and there's a driver and you fall asleep in the wagon. And then the wagon gets to a mountain and the driver takes you up to the top. But you're sleeping the whole time. And then you wake up at the top of the mountain. And at the top of the mountain, the road is flat, right? You don't have any idea that you're on the top of a mountain. There would be absolutely no way for you to know because you slept through the whole ascent, right? The only way to know that you're at the top of the mountain is when you start going down, right? When the wagon starts going down the other side of the mountain, you realize, oh my God, I must have fallen asleep and we must have ascended a mountain. And now I realize that I'm at I was on the top of a mountain, And this is how these personas come to be. This is how the ego comes to be so strong and how we identify with it. Because we actually weren't fully awake when the ego formed, right? As I said before, we develop these personas and these egoic aspects to our personality when we're very young. Our sense of self crystallizes by about the age of 4 or 5, right? Even earlier, according to some. And so we just think this is the way it is. I am this person. I've always been this person. I'll always be this person, right? But in fact, there's also been a part of us that's always been present behind the ego, beyond the ego, that we have been trained to look away from because no one values it. No one thinks it's that important. In fact, according to materialist science, it doesn't even exist. It's just an outgrowth of the firing of our neurology, right? So in mindfulness practice, what we're doing is we're trying to overcome our kind of ingrained, conditioned forgetfulness that's been with us since we were very, very young. And remember who we truly are. Remember who we truly are. Who we've always been, deep down, beneath the personas, beneath the coping mechanisms, right? So today what we're going to do, and Nancy, I saw your hand, and hopefully during the Q&A session, we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, right? And hear some responses. But for now, I want to give us a nice, ample time to practice. We're going to settle in, and I want to invite you to notice a couple things. So I'll speak a little bit toward the beginning of the session, and please allow my voice to kind of be there in the background, but keep your personal experience of what I'm pointing to in the foreground of your attention, okay? We can settle in. We can relax. There's nowhere to be, there's nothing to do. You already dedicated the time to being here now. So you can let go of anything that needs to be let go of. The to-do list, any obligations that you may have dropped to be here. You can go back to those things after we're done. But for now, see if you can let go. Give yourself permission to be here and do one thing. And let's take a couple of deep cleansing breaths to relax the whole nervous system. On the in-breath, we can gather our attention in from its dispersion. And on the out-breath, we can sink more deeply into our seat. The eyes can be open or closed, whichever feels safer, more regulating, more supportive of a soft, gentle quality of vivid attention. And then I want to invite you to bring your attention to an anchor. That could be the rising and falling of your breath. It could be sounds as they arise and move and pass away. Or it could be the feeling of your body making contact with itself For example, your hands touching your lap, or your hands touching one another. And we make a sincere effort just to stay present moment by moment, using this object, the breath, sounds, contact, right, as a support for awareness, as a support for remembering moment by moment to pay attention. Right here and now, we're practicing turning toward our experience instead of willfully ignoring or tuning out or seeking some distraction or diversion. We're midwifing our inner Moses, as it were, into being. You might notice how with sensation in particular, it's very easy to see, right? You're not the sensation. For example, if you're paying attention to the breath, it's very easy to see, right? The breath is moving through you, but you're not the breath. Isn't that so? Or the same can be said of sounds. You're watching the sounds. You're observing them, you're witnessing them. There's no confusion here, right? When a sound arises, you don't suddenly become the sound, do you? No, you remain the witness. Isn't that so? This luminous space of awareness. But then, as you're paying attention to sounds or the breath or the sensations of contact, some sensation may arise and suddenly trigger a cascade of thoughts. And unlike sensations, often when thoughts arise, especially self-referential thoughts like, I need to get more of this, or I need to get rid of this, or I forgot to do the dishes, or I forgot to do this, or I need to do that later, or I remember this, or I regret that. Somehow the witness gets blended into and narrowed into the thinking mind. Not always, but quite often. So much so that we can forget who we truly are. Don't take my word for it. Check it out in your own lived experience here and now. You don't have to make thoughts arise, but when they do, just notice what happens to the awareness, to the witness. Does forgetfulness set in? Is there a blending between the witness consciousness and the sense of, I am this thinking person, making these plans, having these fantasies, thinking these thoughts? The narrowing of our sense of self arises out of forgetfulness. This is a natural process. We don't need to beat ourselves for it, beat ourselves up for it, judge ourselves for it. We just watch it. We watch it happen. We become familiar and intimate with its workings. And we see if there's a way to find our way back to our true nature. Perhaps by coming back to witnessing sensations. We're going to turn to Mourner's Kaddish now. For those who may be in mourning or commemorating the life of a loved one, a friend. And Rachel will screen share Mourner's Kaddish with us. For those who are reciting Kaddish, I want to invite you to place the names of the person or people for whom you're reciting Kaddish in the chat. And unmute yourself. And for those who may be listening, we can unmute ourselves as well and respond Amen at the right time. So just want to thank Rachel for supporting us today. Rachel's going to need to step off in a couple minutes, and Josh will take over, both as host and as tech support. And we'll go from there. Thanks, Rachel. You're invited to rise with me in body or in spirit to recite the Kaddish. Yitgadal.
Amen.
ויפון יום יפון תפארת בית ישראל ועגלה בזמן קריב ישמי רבנו הרב עולם עולמי עולמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתגדל ויתנשא יתהדר יתעלה ויתדלל שמי דגודשה אמין כל ברכתה ושירתה וחתה ונחמתה דאמירן יומה ויאמרו אמן. שלמה רבה נשמיה בחיים עלינו וישראל אמן. עושה שלום במרומה שויה עשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ויאמרו אמן.
שמיה בחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
Memories of those past. Amen. May the memories of those past inspire us to acts of wisdom, compassion, kindness, and justice. And let us say,
Amen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, everybody. And we now have a chance to an opportunity to share some reflections and ask any questions on the teaching, and we'll keep an eye. There we go. All right. And Anne already has a question, and so yeah, keep them coming in. Sorry, excuse me. Okay, yeah, I can't tell who's asking that question, but there is a question coming in. When we are in our daily life doing our chores, where is our true nature? There we go. Get right to the heart of it. Okay. So Sam, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I love that question. It's a question that I'm constantly exploring in my own experience, inquiring into. Because it does seem, right, that we get lost and our true nature disappears. Doesn't it seem that way, right? Have you ever had the experience of doing the dishes and, you finish and you're like, who did the dishes? This happens with my daughter all the time. Like, we sing Shema every night, and sometimes she's really distracted. And when we'll finish, she'll be like, we didn't say Shema. It's like, we did, you just weren't paying attention. So, the power of inertia and habit is very strong. And our forgetfulness is very entrenched. Our tendency to forgetfulness is very entrenched. But I think what's been really helpful for me in addressing this question for myself is a beautiful parable that the Baal Shem Tov again provides. And I think that's also good and relevant given that we had a solar eclipse last week. But the simile or the parable is the light of the sun, right? We have this very geocentric way of saying, the sun set, the sun rose. It's actually not true. The sun didn't change, right? The sun is shining with the same intensity and brightness, whether the part of the earth we inhabit is turning toward the sun or away from the sun, right? And into the sun's shadow. It would be more accurate to say, right? We've turned away from the sun or we've turned toward the sun. That's actually accurate, right? So it's kind of like that as well in our lives, that the sun of our true nature is always shining, right? And this is something you need to verify for yourself. And the way you verify it is that you keep asking yourself under all kinds of situations and circumstances, is awareness present? Is awareness present? Is awareness present, right? I'm in the shower now, is awareness present? I'm doing the dishes now, is awareness present? I'm angry now, is awareness present? I'm equanimous now, is awareness present, right? I just stubbed my toe, is awareness present? So on and so forth. You just keep going. And you keep verifying hundreds and thousands of times, right, in your practice, that actually awareness is ever present. I'm not talking about mindfulness. We lose our mindfulness. But the Buddha taught that mindfulness is itself a mental construction that depends on certain causes and conditions. What I'm talking about is just the bare act of knowing, of being conscious, right? So you may not be mindful that you're doing the dishes, but you couldn't do the dishes at all if there wasn't some baseline degree of consciousness, okay? So the light of the sun, or the light of our consciousness, is always shining all the time. And at the same time, right, we don't see that if we're turned away from it, if our attention is turned outward, right? We need to actually turn our attention back into awareness itself. And all of the practices we're working on this week help us to move in that direction, right? To train our mind to rest back into its inherent luminosity, into its knowing quality, right? When we talk about, for example, awareness as being luminous, right? What we mean is it knows inherently, spontaneously. It has this knowing quality, right? So what we need to do constantly, repetitively, right, is just become aware that we are aware, right? And that is basically the practice of self-remembrance. And we're going to be exploring that tomorrow in great detail. And with training and practice, the more you can become aware that you're aware, at some point the mind naturally reverts back, right, into knowing its own nature more consistently, more fully, even while you're doing the dishes, even while you're walking down the street, even when you're having an argument with someone or conversing with someone in a loving way, even when you're mindless, even when you're mindful, right? So the short answer is it takes practice. It takes practice, but it's not impossible.
And there's a bunch of really good questions that have come in in the chat. I don't think, just to manage expectations, I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of these because they're all, each of them could be a class. But there's a couple about integrated self, and so I want to sort of bundle a little bit and see if you want to respond.
Yeah,
Betsy asked the question, how do we achieve an integrated self, get past the duality of the small self and the true self? There's also a question here about where do feelings or emotions fit in this teaching, which I would think is related. And then there was one here also about that Lori's question, after years of working to undo a pattern of dissociation as a response to trauma, I cringe a bit at the guidance to separate my mind and thoughts from my body sensations. Rather, I try to equalize their importance and voice. How might you address this resistance to splitting witness thoughts versus body sensations in getting to know a fully integrated self?
Yeah, that's
So
really
some easy
that's a
softball
really
questions.
important question, right? Especially for people like me as well who've survived trauma, you know, and who've been impacted by post-traumatic stress. Let me go to the first question, and then I'll address the one related to splitting. When our consciousness becomes so blended into the life of the mind, our thoughts, our emotions, our beliefs about ourselves and others, our perceptions, our conceptions, right? It can be very helpful to untangle the two, right? Because it's very hard to know our true nature as long as our true nature has been co-opted by the thinking mind. Finitude can only know finitude. It can't know infinitude. Okay? And the thinking mind is by nature finite. So the thinking mind can't come to know our true nature. only our true nature, which is infinite, can come to know itself. And untangling awareness from the finite mind is essential for that work. However, ultimately, doing so is for the sake of reintegration, right? So that we can be thinking, if we want to be thinking, or feeling, or sensing in the world, going about our daily routines without becoming entrapped by the finite objects of body, heart, and mind, and world. So I'll just talk about my experience rather than speaking about in the abstract, right? When I started practicing mindfulness, I was instructed to develop this kind of witnessing stance, right? Observing the flow of phenomena rather than being in the stream, you know? And that was really helpful. It brought me a lot of freedom, actually, because I wasn't identifying or blended into, right, or contracted into the activity of the finite mind as much. But then at some point, my teacher, Rabbi Miles Krasson, taught me techniques for actually turning the light of awareness back into itself, which helped me to completely disentangle awareness from finite thinking, right, obsessive thought patterns and the like, and recognize my own nature. But that's not the end of the work, right? The next step for me was that I had to then look back at all of the finite stuff I had disentangled from: thoughts, emotions, sensations, personas, right? Identities, finite identities. I had to look at all that stuff from the vantage point of true nature. And from the vantage point of true nature, in my experience, maybe your experience will be different, but from the vantage point of awareness itself, of true nature, there's no separation whatsoever between true nature and the objects that it knows. I cannot find the demarcating line. I've looked many times, just can't find it. In other words, there's only one reality, right? So even though the disentangling can be important so that we can have enough spaciousness for the mind to rest back into its own nature, ultimately that's not where we want to stay, right? We want to come back to the reintegration to recognize that even finite thoughts, emotions, sensations, objects of the world, other people, they're not separate from the awareness at the core of my being. And in fact, there's only one reality. And as such, even all the finite aspects or expressions of this awareness are holy and perfect and beautiful, right? There's nothing wrong with them. They're expressions of my true nature. I gave yesterday a metaphor of the surface of the ocean and the depths of the ocean, right? So when you're just on the surface, caught up in the waves, everything feels stormy and everything feels agitated. And it feels like, there's no access to any kind of real, genuine peace or calm or what have you. But when you go down to the depths of deep nature, right, it's very peaceful, it's very still, it's very spacious, it's very wide, it's not stormy. But then when you look back at the waves from that place, you realize they're also just water. They're not made of something different. They're made of the same stuff, right? It's just that at the depths, things are peaceful and calm. And at the surface level, things are moving, they're changing, okay? So back to the question of trauma, right, and dissociation, which many trauma survivors can experience, a sense of splitting off from the body, right? What I'm suggesting is that, we don't have to escape or get out of the finite body to recognize true nature in any way, shape, or form, right? All we need to do is recognize that embodied experience is part and parcel of the very awareness that knows it. In fact, what I'm advocating for here is a greater sense of integration and holism and non-duality rather than any kind of split. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. Maybe there's time for one last question here. Again, I'm sorry that we can't get to everyone's. There's a lot of really good questions, but luckily got 2 more days with Sam. So, but Elaine's question I thought was so interesting here. I was practicing Qigong pure consciousness. I found that my true self, my pure consciousness was actually being a Jew. Is that too simplistic? It's not really a finite identity, is it? Or do I just not get it? It's so appropriate for Pesach, I feel like.
Yeah, totally.
So I wanted to lift that one up, Sam, and see what you think about that.
Yeah, again, a question I've thought about a lot and explored in my practice. You know, I'm not going to tell you what your experience should be. Your experience is your experience, of course, and trust your own experience. But what I'd say is that pure consciousness has no identity, no personality, right? No name. It transcends names and forms. It even transcends time and space. So in my experience, it's not Jewish. That having been said, right, I think that on the level of our finite identity, there are certain identities that feel more authentic and other identities that feel more accreted or false, right? So we can feel deeply Jewish, right? But we can investigate, and that can feel like a more authentic identity than, let's say, feeling Buddhist or Hindu or atheist or whatever identity, right? I'm just throwing out identities. Of course, we can be Jewish and atheist, right? But, what I would say is we can look at the feeling, I am Jewish, and we can investigate what are the phenomena that make up that feeling. If we look closely, if we observe under the lens of mindfulness, right? Are there specific sensations? Are there specific emotions? Are there specific thought patterns or beliefs? And if you look at all that stuff, in my experience, you see it's all constructed, it's all conditioned, right? And it's all finite. All of that stuff is changing and moving. Even if it feels like a fairly solid identity, it's porous. It's more porous upon investigation than you might think, right? But then when you look back at the awareness in which this sense of I am Jewish arises, again, it has no form, no shape, no identity, no personality, right? No name, and so on and so forth. So that's just my experience. I'm not saying it needs to obviate your Jewishness or undermine your Jewishness. I'm just saying, right, that there's a distinction between a conditioned personality or sense of identity, even if it feels quite authentic, and our ultimate absolute nature. Okay? Check it out in your own experience. Don't take my word for it. Allow yourself to come to your own conclusions.
Okay, we're at our time right now, so unfortunately, we're going to have to close. If you have additional questions, however, I definitely encourage, if you want to be in touch by email, you can write to support@jewishspirituality.org, and that'll find its way to Sam or to me. And we'll be able to respond to your question that way. I know a lot of people are very engaged on this. Again, Sam will be back tomorrow in the next 2 days, God willing. And we hope you'll join us as well for that. Same time, same channel tomorrow. Thank you so much, everyone, and be well, and we'll hope to see you again.
Thanks, friends.